So right now we're going to talk about what is a species. So to look at species diversity and all the different kinds of species, we need to be able to um, find different organisms out in ecosystems and be able to say what species they belong to. So this is a common thing to think about, and you probably have talked about this before in high school biology or in college biology. So how do you differentiate species? How do you tell when you have one species versus another and be able to classify them into these different groups that we call species? So I want you to pause the video and take a second and think about that. What are some different ways that you could do that? And I will tell you, there are a lot of different answers. So you might come up with some interesting different things. Okay, so now that you've come back, there are a few different common concepts that we use to differentiate species. There are lots of different ways to do this, and many different scientists disagree about this. They all have both pros and cons to them, but the three most common ways that we tell species apart are the morphological species concept, the biological species concept, and the evolutionary species concept. So we'll go through each of these. So the morphospecies concept, or the morphological species, says that species, you can tell them apart based on different morphologies. So if they look different, then they are different. If they look the same, they are the same. And so we pick up an organism and we make a list of things that says, okay, if it has this color and this number of toes on its back legs and this little marking on its face, then it's in this species. And if it's this other color and doesn't have that mark on their face and has this other number of toes on their back legs, then it's the second species. And we do something like that to tell them apart. And in practice, a lot of people do this when you're out and you're catching animals or looking at plants. You go through your list of characters and say, okay, this must be this species because it has all these different characteristics that I say make it this species, and we've all agreed on that. So the problems with this are sometimes variation in how an animal looks or how an animal is shaped don't work very well for this. So we have things like sexual dimorphism. That's when one sex looks different than the other. And so this is really common in a lot of different types of animals. So you can think to the common cardinal, where probably most of you know that the male is bright red and the female is often brown. And so that means that we need different sets of characters for males and females. We might need a whole nother set of characters for juveniles. So it gets very confusing if you have to do that for each life stage and each sex. Sometimes you have color dimorphism. So this picture here shows the same species has two different color morphs. They're called redback, leadback salamanders, and the redback ones and the leadback ones interbreed, and they're really the same species, but you get some with different colors. Sometimes morphology changes with life stage. So like I study frogs. How do you tell that the tadpole and the frog, they go together? You have to have a whole different set of morphological characters for the tadpole and for the frog because they look totally different. Fossils can be very difficult because, you know, what is just normal variation versus what is a species? We don't really know all the time. They've had trouble with some fossils figuring out which juveniles go with which adults, or whether the smaller one is actually a different species or just a juvenile of another species. It gets very confusing. And then we have something called cryptic species, which is where you have things that look the same, but if you look at their genetics, you can see that they haven't interbred in, you know, thousands or millions of years, but they look exactly the same. You can't come up with a single characteristic that tells them apart. So these are some problems with the morphospecies concept. And I just wanted to show this cryptic species. We have one that lives here. They used to all be called slimy salamanders. And they're these skinny black salamanders with longish tails with white spots. And they occur all over the eastern United States. But somebody looked at their phylogenetic tree, they did the genetics and found that a lot of these individuals have been separated and haven't been interbreeding for really long periods of time. And they split them up into all these different species, but you can't tell them apart. Basically, you can't tell which species it is unless you know where you got the salamander from. So you can see where we live in Louisiana, we have Plethodon cassacci. But if you cross the Mississippi River in the state of Mississippi, you'll find a salamander that looks pretty much just the same, and you get the Mississippi slimy salamander, Plethodon mississippi. They look the same, but you have to know where you are to know what species this is. And this is more common than you would think, where we will frequently find species that look exactly the same, but they clearly haven't been interbreeding in a very, very long time. So that means that they're probably not actually a species, even though they look like they might be. Another example is a species that I work on, or two species that I work on. They have different numbers of chromosomes. So what happened is that Hyla chrysoscelis has 2 copies of all its chromosomes, and a duplication event occurred, and there's a frog that looks identical that has twice as many chromosomes. So they cannot breed and make offspring that are viable. But their calls are slightly different. I can tell the difference between the calls of the 2 species, but you might not if you didn't practice listening to the 2. But if you pick one up, there's no way to know. And if you get a female, which doesn't call, there are places where you get both species. It's very hard to tell the females apart unless you look at their chromosomes. So the next species concept is probably the one everybody thinks of. It's called the biological species concept. And it says basically that species are groups of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations, which are reproductively isolated from other such groups. So the idea is that the two individuals can breed and produce offspring. They can also breed and produce offspring. And so if 2 things breed and they don't create fertile offspring, or if they can't breed, then they're not the same species. They're different species. The key here is reproductive isolation. It means there's no exchange of genes between this group and other groups. There are a lot of problems with this. One is allopatric populations, meaning they're geographically isolated in space. If there's a group of this species here, and then there's an area where there's not the species, and then there's another area, 200 miles away, where the species occurs again, or something that looks like the species, how do you know if they can interbreed? Are you going to go collect them and see if they can breed together to figure it out? But it makes it very difficult in practice to know for sure if these 2 things are the same species or not. You can't test it in fossil taxa at all, so there would be no way to determine what's a species in fossils. And then you get asexual organisms. So these are organisms that create offspring from themselves only, and they don't need to breed with something else. So then how do you define what a species is if there is no sex? So we get some things where like single cell things, they just divide. Maybe they don't have any sex. We have plants that can self, so they use their own pollen to make new individuals. And there are even some salamanders and other things that don't need other individuals in order to create new offspring. Another problem is hybridization. So we find that things like coyotes and wolves and dogs can all hybridize and produce individuals that can reproduce. So does that mean that wolves and coyotes are not different species and that wolves and dogs are not different species? Also in plants, we see that plants that seem very different often will interbreed. And so that creates a problem for this biological species concept. So here's an example of hybridization. On the left, we see the red wolf, and on the right is a coyote. And these two species, and we consider them to be different species, can mate and produce fertile offspring. And it makes it very difficult, and there are arguments about whether they really should be considered different species or not. It also makes it difficult for management, so the red wolf is extremely, extremely endangered. I used to work at a refuge where they were reintroducing red wolves, and they had a big problem because there were coyotes everywhere. There aren't supposed to be coyotes in North Carolina where this is. Coyotes were historically a western species, and red wolves occupied the entire southeastern United States. But they're trying to restore red wolves in some areas, but they keep hybridizing with coyotes, and the red wolf genes will just get enveloped into the coyote species if they don't do something to deal with that. The last species concept is one that a lot of people think is the best species concept. It's called the Evolutionary Species Concept, and the idea is that a species is a single lineage of ancestor-descendant populations. Basically, if it's been a very long time since there's been any gene flow between two groups, then we should consider them to be separate species. And so the only way to do this is to use genetics. And we call this the phylogenetic species concept because it's kind of difficult to know for sure because you'd have to look at all the genes of many different individuals from different groups. So we use this, which is called the phylogenetic species concept, which is basically a more specific version of the evolutionary species concept. And it looks at the smallest cluster of individuals, which there is a pattern of ancestry and descent. So they make these different trees with different genes to determine a phylogeny, which is what this tree is called. And the key is to get a monophyletic group. So and that's a group that comes together for one point. So all the B individuals are a monophyletic group. The two E individuals form a monophyletic group, and all the G individuals make a monophyletic group. If you had a species that looked like B and A together, that would not be a monophyletic group. So it would say that those should be two separate species because they've been separated evolutionarily for a long time. Some examples of this include elephants, which traditionally were classified into two species, African elephants and Asian elephants. And there are morphological differences between the two. However, there are also morphological differences between African elephants that lived in forests and African elephants that lived in savannas. And the elephants from the two different ecosystems do not interact very frequently. So they compared the DNA from 21 different populations and found that they were in fact monophyletic groups with respect to habitat. So it showed that there was one group that had all similar genes that were African savanna elephants, and one group that all had similar genes that were African forest elephants, and you can see they both grouped separately from the Asian elephant group. And so this was evidence that there are two species of African elephants using this phylogenetic species concept. And they've gone on to do the same thing with giraffes, where they used to think there was only one or two giraffe species. It turns out there's more than that. And so we're learning a lot by doing these genetic analyses and doing the phylogenetics about what species actually are. So I will stop there.